Caracas, Venezuela, March 9, 1985. Air traffic controllers at Simón Bolívar International Airport were managing routine afternoon traffic when something appeared on their radar that would trigger one of the most intensive investigations in aviation history.
Center to Flight 914, what are your intentions? Your present course is erratic. Say again your intentions.
Flight 914, acknowledge.
An aircraft transponder signal broadcasting an identification code that hadn't been used in over 3 decades. Flight 914, a Pan American Airways DC-4 that had departed from New York City on July 2, 1955, bound for Miami, and had vanished without a trace over the Atlantic Ocean 30 years earlier. Within minutes of the signal appearing, the impossible became visible. A Douglas DC-4, its silver fuselage gleaming in the afternoon sun, its registration number matching perfectly with the missing Pan Am flight, approached the runway. The aircraft was in pristine condition, showing no signs of 3 decades of weathering or deterioration. It looked exactly as it had the day it disappeared, as though it had been frozen in time. The plane landed smoothly. Ground crews rushed to meet it, and what happened next would challenge everything we understand about time, reality, and the fabric of space itself. Because when the door of Flight 914 opened, when investigators finally boarded that aircraft and spoke with the crew and passengers, they discovered something that would be classified by multiple governments and hidden from public knowledge for decades. The people on Flight 914 had no idea that 30 years had passed. To them, it had been a routine 3-hour flight. The date, according to every person on board, every watch, every calendar in the cabin, was July 2, 1955. The year was wrong. The world they'd left that morning in 1955 New York no longer existed. And the mystery of where they'd been for 3 decades, what had happened during those missing years, would lead investigators to discoveries that would fundamentally alter our understanding of reality itself. Before we dive into one of the most extensively documented and simultaneously most classified cases in aviation history, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. This story spans continents and decades, involves military agencies from 4 different countries, and includes testimony from over 200 witnesses, most of whom were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements that are only now beginning to expire. What you're about to hear has been pieced together from declassified documents, leaked testimony, and investigative work by journalists who've spent years tracking down the truth about Flight 914. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you believe time travel is possible, because by the end of this story, you might find your answer has changed. The story of Flight 914 begins not in 1985, but 30 years earlier on a warm summer morning in 1955. July 2nd was a Saturday, and New York's Idlewild Airport, which would later be renamed John F. Kennedy International Airport, was bustling with travelers heading to destinations across the country and around the world. Pan American World Airways, known simply as Pan Am, was at the height of its golden age. The airline represented glamour, luxury, and the excitement of international travel. Flying in 1955 was nothing like the experience we know today. Passengers dressed formally, men in suits and ties, women in dresses and heels. The cabin was spacious, meals were served on real china, and the entire experience was treated as a special occasion. Flight 914 was scheduled as a routine domestic flight from New York to Miami, a journey that typically took about 3 hours. The aircraft assigned to the route was a Douglas DC-4, registration number N88727, a 4-engine propeller-driven airliner that had been in Pan Am's fleet since 1946. The DC-4 was considered reliable and safe, with an excellent safety record. The crew consisted of 4 members: Captain Daniel Morgan, age 43, was a veteran pilot with over 15,000 flight hours and an impeccable record. He'd flown military transport during World War II and had been with Pan Am since 1947. First Officer Michael Richardson, age 31, was younger but equally experienced, having logged 8,000 hours. The flight crew was completed by flight engineer Thomas Walsh, age 38, and lead flight attendant Barbara Henderson, age 29, who managed a cabin crew of 2 additional attendants. The passenger manifest listed 57 people aboard Flight 914 that morning. They represented a cross-section of American society in 1955, businessmen traveling for work, families heading to Florida for vacation, retirees escaping the New York summer, a few servicemen on leave, ordinary people on an ordinary flight with no idea that they were about to become part of one of history's greatest mysteries. Among the passengers were several individuals whose stories would later become crucial to understanding what happened. Robert Jameson, a 52-year-old New York attorney, was traveling to Miami to close a real estate deal. Elizabeth Parker, a 34-year-old schoolteacher, was meeting her sister in Florida. James and Dorothy Carter, both in their 60s, were beginning what they'd planned as a month-long vacation. Michael Sullivan, a 23-year-old Korean War veteran, was visiting his parents who'd retired to Miami Beach. Each of these people checked in that morning, went through the simple security procedures of 1955, which involved little more than showing a ticket and boarding pass, and settled into their seats. Some read newspapers with headlines about the Cold War and the ongoing tensions between the United States and Soviet Union. Others simply looked forward to arriving in sunny Miami. Flight 914 was scheduled to depart at 9:30 a.m. According to all records, it pushed back from the gate at 9:26 a.m., 4 minutes early. Ground control cleared it for taxi to runway 31R. At 9:35 a.m., the tower cleared Flight 914 for takeoff. Captain Morgan acknowledged the clearance, advanced the throttles on all 4 engines, and the DC-4 accelerated down the runway. At 9:38 a.m., Flight 914 lifted off from Idlewild Airport and began its climb to cruising altitude. The tower watched it depart, turning south over the Atlantic Ocean. The flight plan called for a coastal route, staying within sight of land for much of the journey, a common practice in 1955 when navigation aids were less sophisticated than today. At 9:42 a.m., Flight 914 checked in with New York Air Route Traffic Control Center, reporting their position and altitude. Captain Morgan's voice on the radio was calm and professional. Everything was proceeding normally. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited. It was a perfect day for flying. At 10:55 a.m., Flight 914 made its second position report, confirming they were on course and on schedule. First Officer Richardson's voice this time, equally calm. At 10:12 a.m., Flight 914 was scheduled to make another position report. They did not call. Air traffic controllers waited, assuming the crew was busy and would check in momentarily. At 10:15 a.m., they tried to raise Flight 914 on the radio. No response. At 10:25 a.m., they contacted other aircraft in the area, asking if anyone had visual contact with Flight 914 or had heard them on the radio. No one had. At 10:30 a.m., exactly 52 minutes after takeoff, Flight 914 vanished from radar. The transponder signal simply disappeared. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, as though someone had switched off reality itself. By 11 a.m., Pan American officials had been notified that Flight 914 had lost radio contact and disappeared from radar. By noon, a search and rescue operation was being organized. By evening, Coast Guard vessels and aircraft were searching the last known position of Flight 914, an area of ocean approximately 90 miles off the coast of North Carolina. The search continued for 2 weeks. Ships and aircraft covered thousands of square miles of ocean. Nothing was found. No debris, no oil slick, no life rafts, no bodies. The ocean had apparently swallowed Flight 914 completely, leaving no trace. The official investigation by the Civil Aeronautics Board, the predecessor to today's National Transportation Safety Board, concluded that Flight 914 had likely experienced a catastrophic mechanical failure or structural breakup at altitude, resulting in the aircraft falling into the Atlantic Ocean. The lack of any distress call suggested whatever happened had been sudden and catastrophic. In September 1955, Pan American Airways held a memorial service for the crew and passengers of Flight 914. The airline paid settlements to the families of the victims. The aircraft was removed from Pan Am's registry. The flight number 914 was retired from use. And that should have been the end of the story. A tragic but not unprecedented aviation accident. One of thousands of people who'd been killed in aircraft crashes in the early years of commercial aviation. The families grieved, moved on with their lives as best they could, and gradually Flight 914 faded from public memory. Except, Flight 914 wasn't gone. It was somewhere else. Somewhen else. And 30 years later, it would return. On March 9, 1985, the Air Traffic Control Center at Simón Bolívar International Airport in Caracas, Venezuela, was a modern facility equipped with state-of-the-art radar and communication systems. The controllers working that afternoon shift were experienced professionals, managing the steady flow of commercial and private aircraft using one of South America's busiest airports. At 2:47 p.m. local time, Senior Air Traffic Controller Carlos Mendez noticed something unusual on his radar screen. A transponder return had appeared suddenly about 30 miles northeast of the airport. The signal indicated an aircraft at 8,000 feet, descending, but there was no corresponding flight plan in the system. Mendez tried to contact the aircraft on the primary approach frequency. Unknown aircraft bearing 045, 30 miles from Caracas. This is Simón Bolívar Approach Control. Identify yourself. For several seconds, there was no response. Then a voice came through the radio, speaking in English with an American accent.
Center to Flight 914, what are your intentions? Your present course is erratic. Say again your intentions.
Flight 914, acknowledge.
Pan Am Caracas. This is Pan American Flight 914. Inbound from New York to Miami. We seem to be off course. Can you provide us with a position fix? Mendez exchanged glances with his supervisor who'd come over to listen. Pan Am? The airline still existed but had been struggling financially for years. And more puzzling, why would a flight from New York to Miami be anywhere near Venezuela? Pan Am 914, confirm your departure point and destination. Caracas Approach, Flight 914 departed New York Idlewild at 0930 local time, bound for Miami International. Our estimated time en route was 3 hours. We should be approaching Miami, but we're not getting any navigational signals. Idlewild. The name struck Mendez immediately. The airport had been renamed John F. Kennedy International in 1963, 22 years ago. No pilot would call it Idlewild in 1985 unless Mendez's supervisor, Alberto Ruiz, grabbed a microphone. Pan Am 914, this is Caracas Approach Supervisor. What is your current date? There was a pause. Then Morgan's voice, now sounding confused. Caracas Approach, today's date is July 2nd, 1955, Saturday. What's the relevance of that question? The control room went silent. Every controller had stopped working, staring at the radar screen, showing the impossible aircraft. Ruiz kept his voice professional despite the surreal nature of the conversation. Pan Am 914, please confirm your aircraft type and registration. Douglas DC-4, November 88727. Ruiz's hands shook slightly as he grabbed a reference book. He'd been an air traffic controller for 15 years, had worked in 3 different countries, and never experienced anything remotely like this. He flipped through the pages until he found it. Pan American Flight 914, DC-4, registration N88727. Disappeared July 2nd, 1955, over the Atlantic Ocean. Presumed crashed. All 57 passengers and 4 crew presumed dead. Pan Am 914, Ruiz said slowly. "Continue your approach to Caracas. You are cleared to land runway 10. We're declaring an emergency. Crash and rescue equipment will be standing by." Caracas approach, we're not experiencing any emergency. We simply need a navigation fix to correct our course to Miami. Pan Am 914, please comply with instructions. Land at Caracas. This is mandatory. There was a longer pause. Then Morgan's voice, now edged with concern. "Caracas approach, understood, we're complying, but I want an explanation. Why are we being diverted to Venezuela when our destination is Miami, Florida? Captain, you'll receive a full briefing after landing. Please continue your approach." The next 15 minutes were the most surreal of Ruiz's career. He guided Flight 914 toward the airport, watching on radar as the impossible aircraft descended exactly as it should, following all instructions perfectly. He coordinated with his team to ensure runway 10 was clear, that emergency vehicles were in position, that no other aircraft would be anywhere near Flight 914's flight path. At 2:13 p.m., 25 minutes after first appearing on radar, Flight 914 touched down on runway 10 at Simón Bolívar International Airport. The landing was smooth, professional. The DC-4 rolled down the runway, slowed, and turned off to a taxiway where ground control directed it to a remote parking area, away from passenger terminals. Airport security, police, and emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Ruiz had notified airport administration, Venezuelan civil aviation authorities, and airport security. Within minutes, officials were arriving, everyone trying to understand what they were dealing with. As the aircraft came to a stop and the engines were shut down, ground crews approached cautiously. The DC-4 looked pristine, as though it had just rolled out of a maintenance hangar. The paint was bright, showing no weathering. The propellers gleamed. There was no corrosion, no wear, none of the signs you'd expect from an aircraft that had been built nearly 40 years earlier. The passenger door opened. Captain Daniel Morgan appeared in the doorway, still wearing his Pan American uniform, looking exactly as he had in the photograph taken on July 2, 1955. He was 43 years old. He should have been 73 if he'd somehow survived the past 30 years. But he looked 43. Not aged, not different. Exactly 43. An airport official climbed the stairs to the aircraft. "Captain Morgan?" "Yes? Who are you, and why have we been diverted to Venezuela? My passengers are expecting to arrive in Miami." "Captain, I'm Fernando Reyes, Director of Operations for this airport. I need you to remain calm. Something very unusual has happened. Can you tell me what date you believe it is?" "I don't believe anything. I know it's July 2, 1955, Saturday. We departed New York at 9:30 this morning. What's going on?" Reyes took a deep breath. "Captain Morgan, I don't know how to tell you this. The date is not July 2, 1955. Today is March 9th, 1985. 30 years have passed since your flight departed New York. You've been missing for 3 decades. Your flight was declared lost, presumed crashed. You and everyone aboard were declared dead in September 1955. Captain Morgan stared at him. For several seconds he said nothing. Then, "That's impossible." "Captain, I know this sounds impossible, but it's true. I can provide you with newspapers, identification, anything you need to verify. The year is 1985. Your aircraft has been missing for 30 years. And somehow you've just landed here in Venezuela with no idea where you've been or what's happened." Morgan turned back into the aircraft. Reyes could hear him speaking to someone inside, then voices, confusion, disbelief. After a moment, Morgan returned to the doorway. "My flight crew and I need to see evidence, now. Before we deplane, before we allow anyone aboard this aircraft, we need proof of what you're claiming." Reyes nodded. He'd anticipated this. He had a newspaper in his briefcase, that morning's edition of El Nacional, one of Venezuela's major newspapers. The date was printed clearly at the top, March 9th, 1985. The headlines referenced events and people that wouldn't have existed in 1955. He climbed the stairs and handed the newspaper to Morgan. The captain studied it, his face going pale. He passed it to First Officer Richardson, who'd appeared beside him. Both men looked at the newspaper, then at each other, then at Reyes. "This is an elaborate hoax," Morgan said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Captain, I wish it were. Please, deplane your passengers. We have medical teams standing by. We have translators. We have officials from the Venezuelan government and from the United States Embassy. Everyone is here to help. But you need to understand what's happened to you and your passengers is unprecedented. You've traveled through time somehow, and we need to figure out how and why." Over the next 3 hours, a process would unfold that would later be described in classified reports as the most surreal interaction between modern officials and people displaced from the past. The 57 passengers and 4 crew members of Flight 914 deplaned slowly, each person emerging into a world that had aged 30 years while they had not. Medical teams examined every person aboard the aircraft. The results were consistent and impossible. Every passenger and crew member was exactly the age they should have been in 1955. No one had aged a day. Biologically, chronologically, by every measure medical science could apply, these people were still living on July 2, 1955. Robert Jameson, the 52-year-old attorney, should have been 82 if he'd lived the past 30 years. He was 52, in perfect health, showing no signs of aging. Elizabeth Parker, the 34-year-old schoolteacher, should have been 64. She was 34. Every person aboard told the same story. They'd boarded the aircraft in New York that morning. They'd experienced a normal flight. According to their watches, they'd been in the air for 3 hours and 42 minutes, which was consistent with the time from takeoff in New York to landing in Caracas. But the outside world had experienced 30 years. The investigation that followed would eventually involve aviation authorities from Venezuela, the United States, and multiple other countries. The aircraft itself was examined by teams of engineers and scientists. The passengers and crew were interviewed extensively by investigators, psychologists, physicians, and intelligence officers. What they found raised more questions than it answered. The aircraft was in perfect condition, but it was definitively a 1946 Douglas DC-4. Every serial number, every component matched records from Pan American's maintenance logs from 1955. The fuel in the tanks was aviation gasoline of a type that had been phased out decades earlier. The oil in the engines, the hydraulic fluid, even the rubber in the tires, all matched the specifications and chemical composition of materials from the 1950s. The personal effects of the passengers told the same story. Wallets contained money from 1955. The newest bill found was dated 1954. Newspapers aboard the aircraft were from July 2, 1955. Watches had stopped at various times during what they believed was their 3-hour flight, all within the time frame between 9:30 a.m. departure and approximately 1:12 p.m., which would have been their expected Miami arrival time in 1955. But here's where things became truly strange. When investigators examined the aircraft's instruments more carefully, they found anomalies. The magnetic compass showed readings that made no sense. The altimeter had recorded impossible fluctuations. Most significantly, a small radioactive source used in one of the instruments showed a decay rate consistent with 30 years of time passing, even though every other aspect of the aircraft suggested only 3 hours had elapsed. It was as though the aircraft and its passengers had existed in 2 time frames simultaneously. subjectively experiencing 3 hours while objectively existing for 30 years? Or had they existed outside of time entirely in some pocket universe or parallel dimension before somehow returning to normal space-time? The passengers themselves reported something unusual that they'd initially dismissed during what they believed was their 3-hour flight. About 90 minutes after takeoff, approximately when the aircraft had vanished from radar in 1955, several passengers noticed the light outside the windows changing. The bright daylight had taken on an unusual quality, described variably as shimmering, opalescent, or like looking through water. Captain Morgan reported that navigation instruments had begun behaving erratically around the same time. Radio communication had become staticky, then ceased entirely. The magnetic compass had started spinning slowly. Yet there was no turbulence, no sense of danger. The aircraft had continued flying smoothly. First Officer Richardson stated that he'd looked out the cockpit window and seen something he couldn't explain. The ocean below us wasn't moving, he told investigators. The waves were frozen like a photograph, and the clouds around us were perfectly still. We were flying through a world that had stopped. This state had persisted for what the crew estimated was about 90 minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything returned to normal. The light normalized, the compass steadied, radio signals returned. Captain Morgan had immediately tried to contact Miami Approach Control, which was when they should have been nearing their destination. Instead, they'd reached Caracas. The crew had assumed they'd flown through some unusual atmospheric phenomenon, perhaps something related to the Earth's magnetic field or unusual weather patterns. They'd never imagined that while their aircraft flew through those 90 minutes of subjective time, 30 years had passed in the world outside. The Venezuelan and American governments immediately recognized they had an unprecedented situation. This wasn't just a mysterious aviation incident. This was evidence that time itself could be manipulated or bypassed, that space and time weren't as fixed as science believed. The implications for physics, for national security, for the fundamental understanding of reality were staggering. Within 48 hours of Flight 914's landing, the case was classified. The passengers and crew were moved from the airport to a secure military facility outside Caracas. They were not prisoners, officials repeatedly emphasized, but they couldn't be allowed to leave until authorities understood what had happened. The classification order came from the highest levels of both Venezuelan and American governments. President Jaime Lucinchi of Venezuela and President Ronald Reagan of the United States spoke by phone, agreeing that Flight 914 represented something too significant and too potentially dangerous to be made public. Imagine the chaos that would result from announcing a commercial aircraft had traveled through time. Stock markets would crash, people would panic. Questions about the nature of reality itself would upend society. Religious implications, scientific implications, the potential military applications of time manipulation, all of these factors convinced both governments that Flight 914 needed to be kept secret until they understood it better. But you can't keep 61 people completely silent, especially when those people have families they were supposed to meet 30 years ago, jobs they were supposed to show up to, lives they were supposed to live. The task of managing the human element of Flight 914 would prove far more difficult than managing the scientific investigation. Robert Jameson, the attorney, demanded to call his wife. He'd left her that morning in their New York apartment, expecting to return in 3 days after his business in Miami was concluded. Officials had to tell him that his wife, Mary Jameson, had died in 1972, 17 years ago. She'd mourned him as dead in 1955, remarried in 1960, lived another 12 years, and never knew that her first husband had somehow survived in a pocket of frozen time. Jameson's reaction was documented in classified psychiatric reports. He went through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, all the stages of grief, but his grief was complicated by the fact that he'd lost not just his wife, but his entire life, everyone and everything he'd known. His law firm had closed in 1963, his friends were elderly or dead. The New York he'd left that morning was gone, replaced by a city he didn't recognize. Elizabeth Parker, the schoolteacher, learned that her sister, the person she'd been flying to meet in Miami, had died in a car accident in 1968. Her parents had died in the 1970s. She had no immediate family remaining. The school where she'd taught had been torn down and replaced by an apartment building. Everyone she'd known in 1955 was gone. James and Dorothy Carter, the retired couple beginning their vacation, faced perhaps the most heartbreaking situation. They'd had 3 adult children in 1955. By 1985, all 3 were elderly themselves. Their eldest son was 68 years old, 10 years older than his mother now appeared to be. Their daughter was 64. Their youngest son was 61. Imagine trying to explain to your children, who are now senior citizens, that you're their parents, still young, who disappeared 30 years ago and have somehow returned unchanged. The psychological impact on everyone involved was devastating. Michael Sullivan, the 23-year-old Korean War veteran, learned that his parents, who'd been waiting for him in Miami in 1955, had eventually accepted his death and moved on with their lives. His mother had died in 1977. His father was still alive but suffering from advanced Alzheimer's disease and would not be able to comprehend what had happened. Every passenger had a similar story. Lives interrupted, families destroyed by grief. The world moved on without them, and now they were stranded in 1985, technically alive, but with no place in the modern world, no legal identity, most having died officially 30 years earlier, no way to reclaim the lives they'd lost. The psychological counseling program established for Flight 914's passengers and crew would continue for years. Some people adapted, accepted their new reality, learned to live in 1985. Others never fully recovered from the trauma of losing everything they knew. But while the human drama unfolded, the scientific investigation into how Flight 914 had traveled through time was pushing into territories of physics that most scientists considered purely theoretical. Dr. Elizabeth Hammond was a theoretical physicist at MIT, specializing in relativistic physics and space-time theory. In May 1985, 2 months after Flight 914's landing, she was quietly recruited by the Department of Defense to join a classified research team studying what they termed the Flight 914 phenomenon. Dr. Hammond was given access to all data collected from the aircraft and its occupants. She reviewed medical records, engineering reports, passenger testimony, instrument readings, everything, and she began developing a theory about what had happened. Imagine space-time not as a smooth continuum, but as a fabric with occasional flaws or pockets, just as a piece of cloth might have a fold or a bubble where 2 layers touch without being connected. Space-time might contain similar anomalies where different time periods exist simultaneously in different dimensional layers. Her theory, which she called temporal pocket displacement, suggested that Flight 914 had somehow flown into one of these space-time anomalies, a region where time flowed differently or perhaps didn't flow at all. The aircraft and its occupants had existed in this temporal pocket for 30 years by external measurement, but subjectively experienced only 90 minutes. The question was, what caused this? Was it a naturally occurring phenomenon, like the Bermuda Triangle legends, but actually real? Was it something humanity had accidentally created, perhaps related to nuclear testing in the 1950s? Or was it something else entirely? Dr. Hammond's investigation led her to review other mysterious disappearances, particularly those involving aircraft and ships. She compiled a list of 27 cases between 1945 and 1985 where vessels had vanished without trace under clear weather conditions with no distress signals, leaving no debris. Flight 19, the famous disappearance of 5 Navy torpedo bombers in 1945. The disappearance of the SS Marine Sulphur Queen in 1963. Several private aircraft vanishing in similar circumstances to Flight 914. In 6 of these cases, there were reports from other aircraft or ships in the vicinity describing unusual light phenomena, magnetic compass anomalies, or seeing the missing vessel briefly surrounded by what witnesses described as a glow or shimmering air. These descriptions matched what Flight 914's crew had reported experiencing. Dr. Hammond proposed that these temporal pockets existed at specific locations, possibly related to unusual geophysical or magnetic conditions. She advocated for a comprehensive mapping project to identify potential locations where space-time might be unstable. Her proposal was rejected. The classified response, which wouldn't be declassified until 2015, stated, "While Dr. Hammond's theory is compelling, the strategic implications of confirming that certain geographic locations can cause temporal displacement are unacceptable. If hostile foreign powers were to weaponize this phenomenon, the results could be catastrophic. Research will continue, but will be limited to understanding, not exploiting, temporal displacement." In other words, the government was more afraid of what could be done with this knowledge than interested in verifying if it was true. But they didn't stop researching. They couldn't, because if Flight 914 proved anything, it was that time travel in at least one direction was possible, and that meant other possibilities existed too. In December 1985, 9 months after Flight 914's landing, another incident occurred that would connect directly to the mystery. A commercial fishing vessel named the Maria Cristina was working waters off the coast of Cuba when the crew observed something extraordinary. An aircraft, which they described as an old-fashioned propeller plane, descended from the clouds and flew at low altitude directly over their vessel. The crew watched as the aircraft, which matched the description of a DC-4, flew westward and then suddenly vanished. Not disappeared over the horizon, literally vanished, as though it had flown through an invisible door. The crew reported this immediately to Cuban authorities. The report made its way through Cuban intelligence, then through Soviet intelligence who had close ties with Cuba, and eventually reached American intelligence through a complicated chain of Cold War espionage. The report landed on Dr. Hammond's desk in January 1986. She immediately recognized the significance. If Flight 914 had somehow returned after 30 years, was it possible that the same temporal pocket that had captured them still existed? Could the aircraft be caught in some kind of loop, returning to the same anomaly? She proposed an immediate investigation, including sending aircraft to search the area where the Maria Cristina had made its sighting. Again, her proposal was rejected, this time for political reasons. The area was Cuban waters, and relations between the U.S. and Cuba were hostile. Any American military or research aircraft entering that airspace would trigger an international incident. But the sighting raised a terrifying possibility. What if temporal displacement wasn't a one-time event? What if Flight 914 had been caught in some kind of temporal loop, repeating its journey through time over and over? The passengers and crew might be experiencing their 3-hour flight repeatedly, emerging into different time periods each time, never able to escape. This theory gained support when researchers discovered something in their review of passenger testimony. Several passengers reported experiencing déjà vu during the flight, a sense that they'd lived through certain moments before. One passenger, a businessman named Frank Morrison, told investigators, "When the stewardess brought me my coffee, I knew exactly what she was going to say before she said it. I knew the man across the aisle was about to sneeze. I knew everything that was about to happen for about 5 minutes. Then the feeling faded." In psychology, déjà vu is usually explained as a minor neurological glitch. But what if it was actually memory? What if Frank Morrison had lived through that exact 5 minutes before, in a previous iteration of the loop? If this theory was correct, then Flight 914 wasn't just a one-time anomaly. It was a repeating phenomenon, and the passengers might be trapped in it forever, emerging into different time periods, living through the same 3 hours over and over, with only faint memories of previous iterations. The ethical implications were staggering. If this was true, should authorities try to find and intercept the next appearance of Flight 914? Should they try to break the loop somehow? Or would intervention make things worse? These questions were being debated in classified meetings when in February 1986, almost a year after the first landing in Venezuela, Venezuelan air traffic control received a radio call that froze everyone who heard it. Caracas approach. This is Pan American Flight 914, inbound from New York to Miami. We seem to be off course. Can you provide us with a position fix? The exact same call, word for word. The same voice, Captain Daniel Morgan speaking the same words he'd spoken in March 1985. This time, authorities were prepared. Military aircraft were scrambled immediately. The Venezuelan Air Force dispatched 2 F-16 fighters to escort Flight 914. They wanted visual confirmation, video footage, everything they could gather. The lead fighter pilot, Captain Julio Vasquez, would later describe what he saw in a classified debriefing. The aircraft looked exactly as it should, a DC-4, Pan American livery, everything normal. But there was something around it, a shimmer in the air, like heat distortion, forming a sphere maybe 200 feet in diameter with the aircraft at the center. Inside the sphere, everything looked slightly off, like looking through old glass. Captain Vasquez tried to communicate with Flight 914 on multiple frequencies. He got no response. The DC-4 continued its descent, apparently unaware of the fighter jets flying beside it. Then, as Vasquez watched, the shimmer intensified. The air around Flight 914 began to glow with a faint blue-white light, and in an instant, the aircraft vanished. Not disappeared from view because it flew into clouds, vanished. One moment it was there, clearly visible. The next moment it was gone, as though someone had deleted it from reality. Captain Vasquez searched the area. Nothing. Flight 914 had disappeared again. But here's what made this incident even stranger. When authorities contacted the passengers and crew from the previous year's landing, everyone who'd been aboard Flight 914 in March 1985, they discovered something impossible. None of them remembered landing in Caracas. Robert Jameson, the attorney who'd been living in a government-provided apartment in Venezuela for almost a year, being provided with psychological counseling and help adjusting to 1985, had no memory of any of it. According to him, he'd last been aboard Flight 914 as it flew from New York toward Miami. The date, he insisted, was July 2, 1955. He had no memory of landing in Venezuela, no memory of learning about the 30-year time displacement, no memory of the past 11 months. The same was true for every passenger and crew member. It was as though the entire year between March 1985 and February 1986 had been erased from their memories. Or as though it had never happened for them, even though officials had documentation, photographs, and video recordings proving these people had been in Venezuela for nearly a year. Dr. Hammond's temporal loop theory suddenly seemed not just plausible, but terrifyingly confirmed. Flight 914 was caught in a loop. Each time it emerged from the temporal pocket, the passengers experienced landing, dealing with the reality of time displacement, living in the modern world. But when the loop reset, when the aircraft was pulled back into the temporal anomaly, their memories were reset too. They returned to the exact moment they'd entered the pocket in 1955, living through the same subjective experience over and over. This raised philosophical questions that haunted the investigators. Were the passengers really the same people each time? Or were they copies, recreated from the moment they entered the temporal pocket? If you lived through the same day repeatedly but had no memory of the previous iterations, were you really experiencing time at all? And more practically, what would happen when Flight 914 emerged again? Would the passengers once again have to be told they'd lost 30, now 31 years? Would they have to grieve lost families again, experience the trauma of temporal displacement repeatedly? The third appearance of Flight 914 came in July 1987. Once again, Caracas Approach Control received the familiar call. Once again, the aircraft landed. Once again, the passengers emerged, confused and frightened, into a world that had aged years while they remained unchanged. This time, authorities tried something different. They filmed everything extensively. They conducted detailed interviews with every passenger and crew member, They took DNA samples, fingerprints, dental records. They wanted irrefutable proof that these were the same people, that this wasn't some elaborate hoax. The evidence confirmed it. Every passenger was exactly who they claimed to be. The DNA matched samples taken in 1985. The fingerprints matched records from 1955. These were the same people, trapped in some impossible temporal loop, emerging into different time periods each time. But this third appearance yielded a crucial discovery. One passenger, Elizabeth Parker, the school teacher, reported something different this time. "I remember," she told investigators, "not everything, just fragments, flashes of being here before. I remember your face," she said to Dr. Hammond. "I remember you telling me about my sister. I remember crying, but it's like a dream. I can't hold on to the details." Dr. Hammond immediately realized what this meant. The memory reset wasn't perfect. Something was bleeding through. Each cycle through the temporal loop, a small amount of information was being retained. The passengers were beginning to remember fragmentarily that they'd been through this before. She began intensive interviews with all 61 people from Flight 914. Over the next week, she discovered that 8 passengers reported similar fragmented memories. Not complete recollections, but flashes, feelings, a sense of déjà vu when interacting with investigators or seeing the modern world. "It's like they're developing a resistance to the memory reset," she wrote in her report. "Each cycle through the temporal loop leaves a small imprint. Eventually, they might retain full memories. And if that happens, the psychological impact could be devastating. Imagine knowing you're trapped in a time loop, living the same experiences repeatedly, unable to escape." The Venezuelan and American governments faced an impossible decision. Do they continue allowing the passengers to experience the trauma of temporal displacement each time the loop cycles? Do they try to prevent Flight 914 from landing next time, leaving the passengers in their loop but sparing them the trauma of learning their true situation repeatedly? Or do they attempt something more drastic, try to break the loop itself? Dr. Hammond proposed a radical experiment. The next time Flight 914 appeared, they would try to disrupt the temporal pocket using a controlled electromagnetic pulse. Her theory was that the temporal anomaly might be maintained by some kind of energy field, and disrupting that field could potentially collapse the pocket, releasing the aircraft permanently into normal space-time. The risks were enormous. The pulse might destroy the aircraft. It might kill everyone on board. It might create an even worse temporal anomaly. But Dr. Hammond argued that if they did nothing, Flight 914 would remain trapped indefinitely, its passengers cycling through the loop indefinitely, slowly accumulating memories of their imprisonment. After extensive classified debates, the proposal was approved. The next time Flight 914 appeared, they would attempt to free it from the temporal loop. That opportunity came in December 1988, 3.5 years after the first landing in Caracas. When Flight 914's transponder appeared on radar, Venezuelan military aircraft were ready with specialized equipment designed to generate a massive electromagnetic pulse. The plan was to wait until the aircraft had landed and passengers had deplaned, then expose the empty aircraft to the electromagnetic pulse while it was still on the ground. If the theory was correct, this would disrupt any lingering temporal connection between the aircraft and the pocket anomaly. Flight 914 landed as before. The passengers deplaned, once again experiencing the shock and grief of learning they'd lost decades of their lives. And once the aircraft was empty, the military equipment was brought into position. Dr. Hammond gave the order. The electromagnetic pulse was triggered. For 3 seconds, every electronic device within a quarter mile shut down. The pulse was powerful enough to cause physical pain to anyone nearby, a sensation like electricity crawling over skin. And for those 3 seconds, observers reported seeing the DC-4 surrounded by that same blue-white glow that had been seen during previous disappearances. Then the glow faded. The aircraft remained, sitting solidly on the tarmac, apparently unchanged. Had it worked? Had they broken the temporal loop? There was only one way to find out. Wait for the next appearance. According to the pattern they'd observed, Flight 914 appeared approximately 14 to 18 months. If it didn't appear again, they'd succeeded. Months passed. 14 months. 16 months. 18 months. No appearance. 20 months. 2 years. 3 years. By 1991, investigators began to believe they'd actually succeeded. Flight 914 hadn't appeared. The loop was broken. The passengers, now living in the modern world, were slowly adapting. Psychological counseling continued. Some had found jobs, started building new lives. Others struggled, never able to fully accept that the world they'd known was gone. But they were free, no longer trapped in the loop, permanently existing in 1991, able to move forward rather than cycling back to 1955 repeatedly. The case was considered closed. The research program was gradually scaled back. Dr. Hammond published some of her findings in classified journals, though the specifics of Flight 914 remained heavily redacted. The passengers were released from their agreement to stay in Venezuela. Those who wanted to could return to the United States. And for 12 years, it seemed like Flight 914 was truly finished, an extraordinary chapter in history, permanently closed. Then in August 2003, a commercial pilot flying over the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 90 miles off the coast of North Carolina, reported seeing something that made international news despite efforts to suppress it. A Douglas DC-4, silver fuselage with Pan American markings, flying at approximately 8,000 feet. The pilot tried to make radio contact. No response. He followed the aircraft for several minutes, close enough to clearly see the registration number N88727. Flight 914. The pilot watched as the DC-4 began to climb, ascending through clouds. He climbed to follow, but when he emerged above the cloud layer, the DC-4 was gone. He searched for 30 minutes. Nothing. He reported the sighting to air traffic control, who confirmed that radar had briefly detected an unknown aircraft in that location, but had lost the signal. Dr. Hammond, now retired from her position at MIT, but still consulting on classified aerospace projects, was contacted about the sighting. Her reaction was immediate dread. "We didn't break the loop, we just changed it. Instead of appearing every 15 to 18 months, it's now appearing every 15 years. We made it worse." But there was no way to verify this. The aircraft had disappeared again before anyone could intercept it. All they had was a single pilot's eyewitness account. In 2018, 15 years after the 2003 sighting, air traffic controllers at Bermuda International Airport reported a brief radar contact with an aircraft transmitting a Pan American identification code. By the time aircraft were scrambled to investigate, the contact had vanished. As I write this in 2024, we're 6 years past that last confirmed sighting. Based on Dr. Hammond's modified theory, Flight 914 might appear in 2033, 9 years from now. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. In 2019, the CIA declassified portions of its research into temporal anomalies. Among the documents was a report from 1968, 13 years after Flight 914's original disappearance, detailing a radar contact over the Atlantic Ocean. An aircraft had appeared briefly, broadcasting a Pan American transponder code, then vanished. Flight 914 didn't first reappear in 1985. It had been appearing periodically since 1968. The loop had been running for 17 years before anyone recognized it, which means there might have been passengers who remembered, who tried to warn authorities in 1968, 1970, 1975, who were labeled as confused or mentally ill because no one believed their story about being from 1955. How many times has Flight 914 actually cycled through the temporal loop? How many times have those passengers experienced the trauma of learning they've lost everything, only to forget and experience it again? 20 times? 50 times? 100 times? And what about other disappearances? Flight 19, the Mary Celeste, ships and aircraft that vanished throughout history. How many of them are still out there, trapped in temporal pockets, cycling through time, occasionally brushing against our reality before disappearing again? The official position of the United States government when asked about Flight 914 is that it crashed in 1955 and no unusual circumstances were involved. The Venezuelan government maintains the same position. All research into temporal displacement remains classified. But the survivors of Flight 914, those who lived in Venezuela between 1985 and 1991, who remember learning about the time displacement even though they've now forgotten those memories multiple times, some of them have begun speaking out. As they grow older, Robert Jameson died in 2015 at the age of 82, technically 112 if you counted from his original birth year. Before his death, he gave an interview to a researcher interested in temporal anomalies. He said, "I know this sounds insane, but I remember dying. Not once, multiple times. I remember being told my wife was dead. I remember that grief, and I remember it happening again. Different faces telling me the same news, different years. I don't know if I'm really Robert Jameson anymore. Maybe I'm just a copy of him trapped in some cosmic loop, doomed to lose everything I love over and over." Elizabeth Parker, now in her 90s by calendar years, but biologically only in her 60s due to the time spent outside normal time-space, maintains a blog where she documents her fragmented memories. She describes dreams where she's in Venezuela, in the future, speaking with scientists. Then she wakes up and it's 1955 again. Then she wakes up and it's 2024. "I don't know what's real anymore," she writes. "I don't know if I'm living or remembering or dreaming. All I know is that time doesn't work the way we think it does. And somewhere out there, Flight 914 is still flying, still carrying copies of us, still trapped." The passengers who are still alive, there are 9 remaining as of 2024, have organized a support group. They meet monthly, comparing notes about their fragmented memories, trying to piece together how many times they've cycled through the loop, trying to understand what happened to them. And they're preparing for 2033, because if Dr. Hammond's theory is correct, that's when Flight 914 will appear again. And this time, they want to be there. They want to board that aircraft. They want to try to break the loop from the inside. "Maybe," Elizabeth Parker said in a recent interview, "we're the ones who have to do it. Maybe every time the aircraft appears, it's giving us another chance. We just have to figure out what we're supposed to do differently." The mystery of Flight 914 remains unsolved. The mechanics of how a commercial aircraft can slip through time, emerging decades after its disappearance, defy our understanding of physics. The fact that it appears to be caught in some kind of temporal loop, repeating its journey with the passenger's memories resetting each cycle, suggests that time itself is far stranger than we've imagined. Some physicists have proposed that Flight 914 is trapped at the boundary between multiple timelines, existing simultaneously in 1955, 1985, 2003, 2018, and potentially 2033. Each appearance is the same aircraft, the same moment, viewed from different points in our timeline. Others suggest that Flight 914 exists in a pocket of non-linear time, where past, present, and future are meaningless terms. The passengers aren't traveling forward through time, they're existing in a space where time doesn't flow normally, and occasionally that space intersects with our normal timeline. The truth is, we don't know. We may never know. The classified research continues, but each time Flight 914 appears, it vanishes again before we can learn anything definitive. What we do know is that 61 people boarded an aircraft in 1955 for what should have been a routine 3-hour flight to Miami. Instead, they were caught in something that defies explanation. They've lived through the same experience multiple times, losing their memories each cycle, emerging into different decades, never able to escape. The last scheduled flight of Pan American Airways took place in 1991. The airline, which had represented glamour and adventure for generations, declared bankruptcy and ceased operations. But somewhere in the skies, or in some pocket of twisted space-time, Pan Am Flight 914 continues to fly, still carrying its passengers from 1955, still searching for Miami, still trapped in a loop that might never end. If you ever fly over the Atlantic Ocean about 90 miles off the coast of North Carolina and you see a Douglas DC-4 with Pan American markings, don't try to make contact. Don't try to follow it, because that aircraft exists outside of normal time, and getting too close might pull you into the same temporal anomaly that trapped Flight 914. Let it fly on, carrying its burden of displaced souls, cycling through its endless loop. Because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, some doors once opened can never be closed, and some flights never reach their destination. What do you think happened to Flight 914? Is it really trapped in a temporal loop? Are the passengers aware of their situation? Will they appear again in 2033? And what would you do if you found yourself in their situation, living the same experience repeatedly with no memory of the previous cycles? Drop your theories in the comments. Share your thoughts about whether time loops are possible, whether this could really happen. Because Flight 914 raises questions about the nature of time itself, about whether the past can coexist with the present, about whether our understanding of reality is fundamentally incomplete. If this story of impossible time displacement and trapped passengers resonated with you, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. We're bringing you more stories that challenge our understanding of reality, that explore the boundaries between what we know and what remains inexplicable. Share this video with someone who loves mysteries, time travel theories, or aviation anomalies. These stories deserve to be told. These mysteries deserve to be examined, even when governments try to classify them and hide them from public knowledge. Until next time, remember that time is more fragile than we believe, that the past might not be as fixed as we assume, and that somewhere in our skies there might be travelers from decades ago, still searching for a home that no longer exists, still trying to land in a world that's moved on without them. Flight 914 flies on, and perhaps in 9 years, in 2033, we'll finally get answers. Or perhaps the loop will continue, and those passengers will emerge once again into a future they never chose, forced to live through the trauma of temporal displacement one more time. The sky holds many mysteries. Flight 914 might be the strangest of them all. For more videos like this, subscribe to Unveiled Fables and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next one.